So, hello again. Happy Christmas. Should get that one out of the way if you celebrate Christmas. I hope you have a good weekend and whatever else. But today, I'm here to talk about God of War. And basically, I've been playing the game a lot this year. I think I started back in May. I started the game on Give Me God of War, which happened as a spur of the moment thing. And I actually found it quite engaging, and I actually played. I mean, by this point, I've beaten the game. I've started New Game Plus. Did all the Valkyries. I think I did pretty much everything. I bought all the armor sets, everything. So I basically, more or less, outside of collectibles, which I'd already done on my initial save, I have pretty much just cleared everything, done everything on other setting, and it's kind of been with that I've kind of delved a little bit more into some of the RPG elements. And so I wanted to talk about those, but sort of to preface all this, I sort of had mixed feelings of God of War since I finished it. It was kind of difficult to pinpoint what it was. I think there's a lot of things. I think it's in part due to some of these RPG aspects that I sort of, usually because I associate God of War with action adventure, these RPG elements just kind of seemed sort of out of place, but also they didn't feel like they were implemented in a way that sort of, it felt like it was way more complex for the game. It was kind of the general sort of, gist of how I feel. But I think overall the game's very good. I think when it comes to narrative and continuing Kratos' story and introducing this new world and changing combat, it gets a lot right, and I think it's very good at that. And with all these new systems, I think there's a lot of potential with them. And particularly with New Game Plus, it almost feels like some of the problems I've kind of been thinking have actually started to be alleviated, and I don't know if that's by intention, like maybe they figured that out after launch, and without a big overhaul, they were like, well, we've got New Game Plus, we might as well try and do some of it there. But even with that, there's obviously it's still the same game, so some of those problems are still present, and especially on that first playthrough, they're sort of still present. But I think before I kind of get fully into like what I'm saying, that's a little bit of information about how I feel kind of about God of War overall. But I wanted to kind of talk about Santa Monica's sort of, through GDC talks they've kind of spoken about their design goals. They've spoken about the director Cory Barlog's vision book that he had, and that vision book basically contains kind of everything that he was envisioning for God of War, kind of from a narrative perspective, combat, exploration, world, the whole, just everything, and that was given out to, I think, it wasn't all, maybe it was all team members, but obviously it was certainly, there was actually a physical book, and it was a really cool, well put together book that I remember them talking about. But basically in this GDC talk, they kind of run through all of those kind of goals as they're talking about how they change combat and how the different elements of the game changed with the kind of massive shift in how they were making the game and the kind of style they were going for. And I think that they're honestly all really worth checking out yourself, especially if you're interested in game design, but even if you're not, it's interesting to sort of hear, I think, about how things are made. So yeah, if you want to check those out, then you can link them below, but I'm going to kind of go through a few of the things that they touch on now. So the first thing that we should cover here is the kind of three main pillars that God of War 2018 was kind of going to make up. It was the makeup of the game. These were the things that I think Cory outlined as the three things that are kind of almost in like a constant cycle. I think he referred to it as, if you're not doing one of these things, then they need to do better to kind of move you onto one of those things. And they all sort of connect to one central sort of idea in each one of them. And those three pillars, there's one which was father and son, another one was combat, and another one was exploration. And obviously Cory talks in depth about each of these, but I think exploration is kind of, there's a bit of relevance with combat, but I still get into that in a bit. But for exploration specifically, this was obviously, they mentioned it was an area that was new for them, and it was quite stressful. Obviously he said that the entire game was stressful, but that was one particular area that was quite stressful. But the goal with exploration was they wanted to create mechanics that encourage and reward exploration, that kind of, I assume, make you want to explore and are curious to see, what's around that corner, or if I take the boat over there, what is sort of there. And through those three core pillars, they wanted to tie them into the sort of a central idea of character growth. E.g., in every single one of those, there is some relevance to character growth. So that can be, there's various ways that it can be, but a couple of quotes that I pulled from the slides was that he says, see characters develop from your actions and change through action and mechanics. And so, as I said, that because that ties to all three of those, whether that's the sort of growth between Kratos and Atreus as father and son. You've got for combat, it's the growth in like your combat prowess and skill, and getting better or unlocking new stuff. And I assume for exploration, there's the growth in as you play through the game, you're unlocking new things that allow you to access new areas, and you're also exploring more, hopefully, and you're acquiring new things that kind of, enhance whatever it is in different ways. And they kind of all, I don't know if father and, well, I guess no, father and son would sort of coincide with those two because of the fact that father and son does have a gameplay element as well, and combat, and so all three of those kind of do connect in some form, and then obviously they all connect in their own way to specifically character growth, and that's something that's relevant throughout the entire game. And through all of the things that they do, you can totally get, like, you can see where those particular elements kind of are coming out. And so that was from Corey Barlog, creative director, I believe, his GDC talk called Reinventing God of War. As I said, they're all linked in the description, so you should definitely check them out. So as I said, you can see all these manifested in the final game in different ways. But as I'll get into a bit, I think certain elements, particularly RPG side, like random chance perk activations, and a lot of the stats kind of get in the way of some of the proper growth for combat and exploration that I think you can have within God of War, and I think that's kind of what they were shooting for, but I think it doesn't fully reach the point that they could have gone to, and obviously that's what I'm going to fully get into in a bit. These elements are pretty complex for what I believe the game to be. I don't want to say the game's straightforward in that it's basic or it's not good, because that's totally not what I mean. But those elements, like perks being randomly activated, and a lot of stats that suggest you can build into these particular sort of play styles and create your own build crafting things. I don't think they fully align with character growth because they don't get the time to properly breathe, because I don't think the game allows for it, because largely the game is trying to be an action adventure game. But yeah, before I'm kind of like, I'm half jumping ahead, I'm sort of like, I'm leading into it, so before I get too much into that, I'm going to roll it back and talk a little bit more about some of the other goals that were spoken about in the other GDC talks. So yeah, in this second GDC talk I'm going to cover here, lead gameplay designer Jason McDonald talks about God of War gameplay and about how they were going to change a lot of the elements that sort of make up that gameplay. That's in his talk called Taking an Axe to God of War Gameplay, and he basically talks about, like, one of the things he talks about, I think in regards to kind of, I think it's one of the sort of from Corey's vision book, they were talking about the word deliberate. They're saying this Kratos is more older, what he does, he thinks about more, and so everything that he does is they want to deliver this, the idea of being deliberate with your actions. And when they were designing the new combat system, that was something that kind of drove them to kind of think, what does that word mean? How does that, how would that work in terms of a new system? Like, what kind of things would they be looking for to change? And obviously that led to a lot of the design shifts that we've seen in 2018. And another thing to talk about is a character fantasy goal for Kratos is to be the embodiment of power. They want him to, obviously, we've seen him kill like pretty much all the gods and goddesses in the Greek pantheon, so it's like, he's a pretty strong guy, and you see a lot of that in 2018. And so obviously I think they deliver a lot on that sort of character fantasy goal, and they, the combat certainly delivers that feel, but I don't think that they fully line up with that vision goal in every single way. And so kind of, coming back around to the thing I mentioned earlier, was about the idea of these perks that activate on chances. There are chance, they call them perk chance activation, I believe, is the kind of, that's usually the terminology that they use in the game. And to me, I don't think that fully lines up with the word deliberate. Now, there is, some of that is sort of not fully true, because even if it's a chance of the output happening, there's still a deliberate decision in that you're making to, when you're going to attack. But I think because the output is so inconsistent and random, primarily on that first playthrough as you're still leveling up, that kind of, you're not fulfilling the kind of point of that, piece of gear, that armor piece, or the axe pommel or blades pommel or whatever. And what doesn't help is that they have a range of chances from very low to very high. They literally have very low, low, moderate, high, and very high. And they have all of those, and there are obviously certain things have, certain pieces of gear have very low, and a lot of the cool, at least what seem like the stuff you want to, you'd be interested in, they have like low perk activation chances, so they don't happen very often. And so I think the goal here was to kind of push you to build for the luck stat, and that the idea was you'd put tons of points into your luck and you would build for that, and then you would be able to unlock some of these sort of potential. But as I'll get into a little in a moment, it's like you don't fully get to build for that until like way later into the game. And I don't think this really aligns with how Kratos is the guy, and his fighting style, because it doesn't express embodiment of power. It doesn't, he like, Kratos isn't the kind of guy that is just going to be like, oh, I'm going to, hack away at this enemy, and, one of these hits is going to give me this perk. It's going to activate that, and I'm going to be able to do something cool. I just think he's the kind of guy that if he wants something done, he'll get it done. And, in the old games, they obviously, the way they kind of had that kind of embodiment of power was one through the combat and some of the, the finishes and the brutal takedowns. But they also had magic, and, if you wanted to use magic, you pretty much just, as long as you had enough magic in your magic gauge, you just pressed a single button. And they kind of have something similar in God of War 2018 with Runic Attacks, but they're on cooldowns, so they function a little bit differently. And I think the problem with the elements being on a chance activation is that depending on how consistent that is, if it's not happening very often, then it's not consistent. And a big part of God of War 2018 is that it's an action game, and in an action game you want things to be consistent because there's a lot of skill, I think, to a lot of God of War 2018's combat, and in learning enemy attack patterns and what you can block and what you can't, and what's better to dodge, and when to block the enemy. There's a lot of things you've got to learn, and there's certain enemies you've got to learn on the best ways to take them down with the abilities that you've got on hand. And so these you can't rely on something that's not always going to happen, because in the moment-to-moment gameplay, you need to be focused on hitting that goal and clearing out those enemies and finishing the fight. And I think on easy, normal, and probably hard, it's not too bad, because you that's kind of the game's obviously a little bit easier. But obviously on Give Me God of War, there's a little bit more focus on, right, you need to be heads down focused, where are these enemies attacking from, and you need to be quite aware of your, I think in a lot of ways, Give Me God of War is where a lot of these combat goals do come alive, because they kind of, even though some fights are a lot more difficult than others, there is still a lot of skill, in awareness and, taking in the level where enemies are appearing, sort of thing, and it can be a trial and error kind of thing. And I personally had a pretty great time with Give Me God of War. I heard mixed things about it, but and I'm pretty happy I beat the Queen Valkyrie and all that. It's, and it was a fun time. I don't know how long it took me to do it all, but it was I've played a lot of it sort of on and off this year. But that's kind of getting off on a tangent, so if we, to get back to what I was talking about, because God of War's got like a lot of these RPG elements, at the core it's obviously still trying to be a linear action-adventure game, and that's how it's promoted in like all of its marketing. And it's trying to tell a single story, about Kratos and Atreus and their journey to the highest peak in all the realms, to scatter their mother's ashes, and obviously, and that was the general idea. And of course, I think they do that pretty well, and all of the action adventure elements, I think, are pretty much, they're fine. I don't. There's very little problem I have with them, or anything I can sort of critique, unless I was being picky. And I think mainly my problems lie with the RPG side. And as I said, so I think they've got the action adventure side down, but the RPG elements, I think, really don't need to be as complex or as inconsistent as they are for a lot of the time. I think considering how the rest of the game is, they should be streamlined and to be a lot more accessible and easy to use, in combat. And, I think it's totally fine for some things to require skill, but to have so much complexity and randomness and stuff like that, it's so kind of strange to me, because I'm like, what? why have all of these elements? You know, because at the end of the day, God of War is the kind of game that most people are going to finish the main story, maybe some side content, potentially, you know, dip their toes into some of the end game stuff, but I doubt many people are going to fully grind the game or anything like that. And, you know, one thing to keep in mind is that there is New Game Plus, but that was added after launch. And so while New Game Plus does, from what I've seen, kind of lean into a lot more of these elements, and you get massive stat boosts that really kind of enhance a particular stat, that you notice the difference. In standard playthroughs, that's not really the case, unless you're right at the other end of the game and you really, really spec into something. And I think that's pretty difficult, you know, to do. And one thing they talk about for combat is that they wanted combat as a whole to be accessible, and so you would think that they would also, considering the RPG elements have quite a, you know, that you kind of you're obviously got to equip high level gear as you play because enemies are getting high level, so I would imagine that accessibility they'd want to apply to the RPG elements. They don't want to kind of boggle people's minds, you know, while they're playing. And I think, after I've been playing more of the game, I think these perk activation chance abilities can be better, and they should be better. In more of a, you know, to take what the Santa Monica have been saying, they can be changed to become more deliberate, accessible, and consistent in a way that would create more intentional design within the combat and RPG elements of God of War. Specifically, I'm on about, you know, those deliberate choices yielding obvious and viable results that allow you to, you know, properly buildcraft in God of War. And there's potential here, but I don't think they've hit that point just yet. So, since I'm going to be talking about sort of my experience with God of War this year, pretty much everything I say from this point on is based on Give Me God of War difficulty and playing on New Game Plus, or at least some of this is based on New Game Plus. But generally, I'm going to be talking about my experience with the game on Give Me God of War difficulty. So the first thing I want to talk about is one of the axe pommels that I found that was I think it's from Muspelheim that I've got. That's an upgraded version of one that exists on the standard game that I think is the same, but it's got a bonus to it. And so this is, I believe it's pronounced Surtr's Grip of Flame Plus, and usually a lot of reprised gear has plus at the end of it to signify it's the New Game Plus version, or like an upgraded version. And if I'm honest, this is one of the most fun items I've found in New Game Plus. Like, it's one of those that I found, and thanks to the design and the of like perks and the addition of stats on New Game Plus armor, I've been able to like actually use consistently within the game. And so basically, obviously it comes with the usual sort of boost to a few stats, but its main perk is a low perk activation chance to grant the Wrath of Flame buff on any axe hit. And this particular buff, it increases strength, it restores a small amount of health, and it fires a wave of fire energy on normal attacks. And that last part, I don't know if I fully noticed the strength part or the health necessarily. I'm sure I've probably, you know, it must work, it works, but I've just, one of those I've not noticed because the main thing I focused on is that wave of fire energy. And so what happens is that because of my luck, I believe my luck is currently at 135, and that's because of 3 of the New Game Plus armor sets plus a few of the enchantments I've got. I've just pretty much just like knocked that up high, and it's also not like fully sacrificed other stats I've got. What it's doing is it's making these particular elements occur a lot more often. So I must be seeing this thing activate probably every 10 hits or so, or within about that, and it's actually been that good that even though I have a bias to the Blades of Chaos, I have actually moved to using the axe primarily, because the way it works is that, like, obviously the axe has permafrost on it, so as you get hits without taking any damage, you build up this frost, and when it sort of fully charges up, you start to deal frost damage to enemies. But then, not only have you got that, like, eventually working, you've then got this axe pommel that's granting you a wave of fire energy on normal attacks, you know, every so often, and it's like a 10-second buff. And so every time you're doing an attack, it's actually sending out this, like, line of fire that's not only dealing damage on impact, it's also starting to tick up a status effect of fire. And I haven't fully, like, tested it in every single way, but this means you can kind of, like, you can be almost slowing enemies while setting them on fire at the same time. And I've been like, holy crap, like, this is really cool. This feels like that's the kind of thing that they want to do. And it could be that it's New Game Plus, and they, they kind of want it to go a bit crazy, but it really feels like, for one of the first times, even though this is a low perk activation chance, because my luck stat is like jacked right up to 135, I'm seeing this perk activate consistently. It's something I can rely on. Like, even though it's not a guarantee that it's going to be on X number of hits, it's happening often enough that I'm noticing it all the time. Like, every single fight it's coming on. And it's, like I said, it's making me not use the axe, because it's made me go, oh, I don't need the axe anymore. Or, sorry, it's making me not use the blades, because I'm so, impressed by this ability on the axe, then I'm like, oh, holy crap, that's cool. And obviously the blades are still going to have their use, because certain flying enemies are going to be great with that. But since I have a bias towards the blades, it's really cool that there is something in the game that pushes me away from that and pulls me to the axe. And so next, specifically kind of bouncing off that, I want to talk about the luck stat. So as I said, on New Game Plus, with Gimme God of War difficulty, I've got 135 luck. And because of that, as I said, these effects that that I didn't notice very often before, they're actually happening quite often. If it wasn't New Game Plus, you'd barely ever notice them. I remember there was, when you beat Magni and Modi, you get an axe pommel that has a low perk activation chance, I believe, to inflict shock damage on enemies. And I've definitely seen it a few times, but I cannot tell you. I can't remember exactly fully what it does, and I've used it. I remember doing a lot of Muspelheim stuff at the end of a standard game on my standard playthrough, and I barely noticed this thing occurring. I think I put it on because of I think it has luck on it, or it has cooldown. It has some stat that I'd put it on because I think it was a mix. It was like, oh, I see it's got shock on it. Let me see what that's like. And I remember seeing it activate, but it just wasn't very often. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I guess they don't want to make it super easy or overpowered and stuff. But I was like, but this thing's unreliable, because why would I want to use it? Outside of the stats, because the actual perk effect, which I feel like is the driving force for you to use it, is barely happening. And the reason why luck is difficult to build for in standard playthroughs is that there's not really much to serve that actual stat for you to build into, or for you to sort of build up. And I went through and counted, and there's only 3 armor sets with points that go into luck. And obviously, as you upgrade them, the level increases, and the luck stat increases with it, and as well as the other stats. Actually, I don't know if the luck stat does increase. I think there's some cases where the luck and cooldown stats don't increase. I might have to check with that, but I think there's a few cases where that doesn't happen, where even when you upgrade them, that luck stat stays the same, at least on one of the upgrades. But the problem with these armor sets is that you can't get them to max level. 2 are of the legendary rarity. One is Brock's armor set, and the other one is Sindri's armor set. And the 3rd armor set is rare, so it's not even, definitely not going to hit max level. Now, obviously, you can use enchantments as well, because those can build on top of the luck stat and various stats. So that is something else you can use. But the stat type and amount, as well as the perk, can all be randomized on some of them. Some of them are, I think, locked, and you can't even sell them, I assume, so that you don't totally run out, and that you can always go back and use them if you need them. But yeah, if you want something that's built for luck, you're probably going to have to grind for it, unless you just get lucky as you play, and you're going to need multiple of them. And obviously, if you're speccing more into luck, you're going to then be losing out on another stat. And I don't necessarily think that's inherently bad, but you're not really getting a sense of how much you're actually losing out on either. And especially on Gimme God of War, you kind of want to prioritize your higher level, and that's the thing. So if you're prioritizing higher level, because that does kind of govern a lot of the incoming and outgoing damage, you're going to want to make sure you're using everything of a high level anyway, and that'll be the driving. That's the reason why you're that's the reason why you're going to be changing gear, is because you want a high level and you want to survive longer, especially on the harder setting. And see, I don't think that God of War having some kind of grindy element is necessarily bad, but I also question, is that really what God of War is? And also, does the game really serve much reason for you to use that, outside of wanting to just test a particular perk? And I'll be honest, I just don't think God of War players, or most people that play the game, aren't really interested in. I think Buildcrafting is a bit of a niche thing anyway, but it's like God of War makes them niche in the most ridiculous way. It's like, it's niche for a niche audience. Like it's even more niche than niche. It's because it doesn't have much of an impact. And obviously, there's also axe and blade pommels for extra points as well. And as I said, yeah, you have to really spec into luck if you want it to activate these effects on standard playthroughs. And plus, like, building onto that, is that a lot of these better upgrades are going to be available like late into the game, or if you're grinding or completing all the side content. And like I said, I just don't think most people are going to do that. I think it's like, it's great for those that do, but even for the ones that do, they're not getting the full. They're not getting an embodiment of power. They're not getting to like build up Kratos and make him super strong at the end, unless you are really grinding and really tinkering in a lot of different ways. And if I'm honest, going by my experience so far with New Game Plus, I can see why someone might do that in New Game Plus, but on the standard game, I just don't see it happening. And so, to sort of break away from God of War, specifically God of War for now, I wanted to sort of compare another game, specifically Destiny 2, in regards to the combat flow and build crafting systems. And so, sort of just to say before I sort of say this, is that none of what I say here is obviously me trying to say that God of War should copy Destiny and like everything it does, because I believe that God of War is, and it should be, its own game, and it should stay unique, and they are very different in a lot of ways. But I do think that in the combat and build crafting sort of integration, they do have similarities in a lot of ways. And so I think God of War demands a lot more moment-to-moment skill from the player as a whole. Destiny obviously has its own skill-based things, but I think generally God of War is like, a lot of it is on you. Destiny's an online game, you've got other players around at times. God of War, it's all on you. It's up to the player. The player, you have to kind of embody that and take on fights yourself, sort of thing, and figure out how you're going to beat them. Whereas Destiny has a much wider sandbox and a lot of different activities where you can properly test abilities and weapons, and they're all varying difficulties, so its content structure is very different to God of War. And there's also a large amount of enemies of varying tiers, and the sandbox is designed around those effects being guaranteed. So, it's very different, is basically what I'm trying to say. And so I want to use an example from Destiny about a build sort of that you can make. I think it was sometime in year 3, I believe, where they added what they called a charged with light system, where you essentially, you do something and you become charged with light, up to, I think it's 2 stacks, and then you can find different ways to increase the stack limit, and you achieve different effects by spending those stacks of charged with light. So one example is that you gain heavy damage resistance when your health drops to a low level, and the effect of that increases the more stacks of charge with light you have. And so it's one that I've used a lot in Destiny, where it's like, it's kind of just an easy passive thing that you can put on that helps for solo content. It can help with just playing with other people. The thing I've got going on with Destiny at the moment is basically I've got a very melee and finisher sort of based build, where I'm being able to get kills with a melee ability, and it's on stasis, so I have 2 charges of them. And that allows me to turn invisible and gain health back with a certain exotic helmet, and because of the stasis set of abilities I'm using, I'm able to pick up things that the enemies drop by getting kills with stasis abilities that then give me energy back for my abilities. And so it's kind of this constant cycle, and in the midst of that, I'm also getting this charge with light thing, where I am picking up orbs of light, which you generate from upgraded weapons and from using your super abilities, and you pick those up, I become charged with light, and so then when I'm low on health, suddenly that damage resistance kicks in, and I'm able to survive longer, kind of thing. And that's something that I think I half stumbled upon with Destiny, but I sort of also knew what I was doing at the time, and then I found this helmet that was been in the game for a while. I was like, oh, this is really cool. It's called Assassin's Cowl. If anyone's played Destiny, then you know what that is. I think it's an underrated helmet. I'm surprised it's not used more. But anyway, whereas God of War is very different to Destiny. And God of War has enemies that are susceptible to certain attacks and elements. You have to stun them with a specific approach to kind of, properly attack them. And Destiny has some of this for sure, but it's not always in that same way, especially for like a lot of the moment-to-moment gameplay, which I think you could say is comparable to God of War's kind of your first playthrough sort of thing, or lower difficulties. And I didn't actually realize this, but there are actually some chance-based elements in Destiny's sort of mods and builds they've got, but they are generally few and far between. Like, a lot of the time it is that you do something, you get something, and you know what's happened, kind of thing. You read it, and it's not some things are a chance, but generally it's pretty consistent at, like, you know, saying it's going to do it, and it does it, sort of thing. And if it doesn't, it's usually noticed as a bug or something that's kind of, you know, whether you've got to prepare it with some kind of setup. Sometimes it can be a bit finicky with some things, and, you know, but pretty much 95% of the time it works, you know, as intended. And Charged with Light specifically, you can only kind of gain those stacks depending on the mod you've got on. That's that I've been using the one that you pick up orbs of power that are generated. You can break an enemy shield of the same type of the element they're going to be using. You can use a finisher, you know, but these are customizable by the player. And it's almost like you as a player in Destiny, you can kind of break apart these elements, and you can kind of build the way you want to activate it, as well as the way you want to sort of, you know, use what you've got from activating it. You can choose how to use that, essentially. And obviously they've got, you know, two entire tiers of weapons. They've got legendaries and exotics, and that carries across weapons and armor. And so to kind of give an example of one of those choice-based elements in Destiny 2, and to sort of talk about my thoughts on that, a newer system that I believe they introduced at the beginning of this year, year 4, was called Elemental Wells. And they basically, when you pick them up, they grant ability energy to all of your abilities. And I believe it's divided based on the number of uncharged abilities. So it means the more abilities you have charged, the more energy goes to the uncharged abilities, basically. And they have different kind of functions depending on, you know, what you're using, and whether it's the same element as your subclass and all that. But one mod usable within this to generate elemental wells is a mod that has an escalating chance to spawn an elemental well with a weapon that matches the damage type of the equipped subclass. And it sounds a bit loaded, that, but I think the reason why I don't think this is too bad, obviously, you know, even if it's a bit complex, is that, well, one, it's activated by any subclass element matching weapon, and so you can usually have at least one or two, but you can have three, depending on if you've got a perk on your primary weapon. Two, there's also a ton of enemies in Destiny, including a lot of weaker, what they call minor enemies, and it's also an escalating chance. So every enemy you kill is giving you a higher chance to, you know, for an elemental to drop. I assume once an elemental is dropped, that chance then gets reset back to like a baseline, and then it kind of builds up again. I don't know. I don't know exact numbers myself, and they're not shown in the game all the time either. But these wells can also be created through other means and generated by other players. Now, obviously, that's not entirely reliable unless you're actually communicating with your team and you've all got like a synergy going on with your build. And again, it's not like God of War can do this because it's only one player. And, you know, unlike God of War, these elements are not only limited to a single weapon you've got. You can kind of, you know, you can have it if you're using a Void subclass and you're talking about Void Elemental Wells, you can generate those Void Elemental Wells with at least two Void weapons. One of those could be a primary, like a weapon, so you're going to have ammo. They've added infinite ammo for primary weapon for kind of standard, you know, rifle-based things and SMGs and stuff like that. You're kind of, you know, the weaker guns in the game now have infinite ammo, and so essentially, even though it follows a similar path to God of War, there's still a lot of consistency, or more of a guarantee that it's going to work. And so, if we're going to then compare this back to God of War, and how God of War has its chance-based perks, God of War doesn't have tons of enemies all the time, and the combat system was both designed and implemented as something that's a little bit more tactical and strategic, that you kind of it wants you to think about how you're going to take on the enemies. For example, you know, certain enemies require certain setups to attack, so it's not always possible that you can fight in the exact same way all the time. And, you know, sure, Destiny has some of that, but generally you can kind of reliably execute certain elements of your build in Destiny, unless you are really just building against what you're going into, sort of thing. And again, if in a lot of Destiny's endgame content, you typically know what you're getting yourself into, and it kind of tells you some of the things you might want to kind of equip for that activity, at least in regards to It doesn't tell you everything. Like your core builds are like it's not going to tell you about, but certain elements that it's going to say, oh, okay, well, they have these things called champions, and you might need an anti-barrier weapon to take on those champions, and so that's the kind of thing it tells you. It just warns you about the kind of things you'll come up against, so you can kind of get some idea of like the things you're going to need, and then the rest of the build is kind of up to you. But yeah, in terms of God of War, its combat and kind of the flow of everything, it stems from the action adventure sort of design that they've got going on, and I think that means that it gets in the way of fully letting these build crafting elements sort of exist, because it's constantly, you've got one that's saying, okay, so we want you to fight these enemies in specific ways, and we want you to, this enemy's in the air, so you might want to throw your axe at them. This enemy's going to teleport away, that's the Revenant, and you're going to need to hit them with the Tracer's arrows to stun them, and then you can attack them. You've got some enemies that charge up with fire, the Draugr, so you don't want to hit them, you want to make sure you want to hit them when they're further away. You've got some nightmares that suddenly fly towards you and explode, and so you want to make sure that you hit them. And it's these really specific ways that aren't bad in themselves, but they then prevent you from fully expressing yourself in the combat system, because of the fact that the game's constantly throwing you challenges, and you're also trying to build your own way that might not be suited particularly for that kind of fight, which then means not only is it a low perk activation chance anyway, you're also not getting to fully get those moments to attack in the ways that would then proc and activate these different perks. And even with the way that these items work, there's no insight the game gives you onto how consistent they might work. How consistent it's actually going to activate. And as I've just said, the game structure doesn't really allow for it, because it's so, curated and designed in a way that's telling you how to play, but the game's also saying, but you can choose how to play if you want. And it's like, what? Like, what are we doing here? An example that I sort of written down here is Sindri's Royal Dwarven Breastplate, a chest piece as part of Sindri's armor set. It's one of the ones that comes with luck that I mentioned earlier. Its perk is that it comes with a moderate chance to grant Protective Barrier, which prevents taking damage from enemy attacks whilst using a Runic Attack. So here, I see the intent with what they're trying to do, and it's again one of these sort of build crafting elements. But again, you want the game to be consistent with what it's doing. Why not just grant that Protective Barrier as a guarantee, and then maybe stick it on a 5 to 10 second cooldown to prevent those runics from being spammed? If that's the worry, then it should be built a different way. Because what you're saying is, you're giving an armor set that has a unique perk that no other armor set in the game has. I think there's a couple of enchantments that maybe that can have this. I'm not 100% sure. There's a lot of similar terminology used in the different ways you can activate it across the game. It's difficult to remember off the top of my head what's where and stuff. But yeah, if they believe that's gonna be a worry, they should change it. They should make it a guarantee, so you know that this build, because then you can spec into that. You can build Runic and build for that. So you could put your damage dealing moments in your Runic attacks, and know that when you're actually using those attacks, you can't take damage. But as a result, you can't necessarily spam them all at once, which might be how you might want to play. You might want to try and get them all off quickly, and then go into standard combat, and then use the talisman that can get them all back. So I think that's a workaround, that they could do here. But then the question is, well, how easy is that going to be for players to understand that? But I also don't think it's very good to have a random chance thing either. So God of War it's showcasing itself as an RPG, but I say it does, but in some ways it shows it, like in all the menus, it sort of parades around like it's a full-on RPG, but in the combat and the way that it all functions, it's not really letting itself be that RPG, and not only that, a lot of elements are kind of easy to ignore on difficulties, particularly on hard and below, because the power level, as I mentioned earlier, is the strongest element that governs the outgoing and incoming damage. But anyway, on that particular point, I do think a cooldown would be the good way to kind of stop people from spamming runics, but allowing you to know that you're being able to use that runic attack with a protection in that moment. And I think that, again, it's deliberate. You know what you're getting yourself into, it makes sense, and you can start to kind of build around that idea, like what better than you currently can. So I'm just going to quickly roll it back again to Destiny. Okay, I know I keep trying to jump back and forth here, but I'm sort of, it's a weird structure. I'm just trying to follow through on all my points. But comparing Destiny and God of War again, as I said, that they're obviously very different games, and they have different gameplay loops and combat. But as I mentioned before, I believe that the builds and customization elements do share similarities. But obviously, Destiny is also a live service game with new content being brought in regularly, like every season, every 3 months, every year. Uh, and so I think it's on top of the game's overall structure that makes all of those elements work the way they do, because the game is constantly kind of evolving and changing. So there's always new things to kind of build for. And obviously, God of War, it's a single player game that's more streamlined and largely linear. And so while it does have side quests and end game content, you're kind of for a lot of people, it's gonna be a one and done kind of game. You're gonna play through it, and that's it. You're gonna get the story, and again, it's one of the strongest parts of the game. What people are gonna play it for. And when it comes to that end game content, I don't think it's that varied. I think it's visually, and it's a lot of interesting elements around it, and I think it's cool what they did. But I still don't think it's that. It's still some of the that again. It's one of those that shows potential, but I don't think it fully reaches the sort of peak of what they could do. Um, and again, because of the way it's designed, it demands a higher power level, which then, of course, then gets in the way again of you properly creating your own builds. And so that means it then, again, becomes difficult to kind of pick what weapon's best, whether you want to use the axe, the shield, or the blades, same with your armor set and enchantment, and you can't really properly build around it. But it doesn't mean it doesn't ever work, or it can't ever work, because, as I've mentioned a few times, is that there is clearly potential here. There's a lot of good ideas that I think can work. And again, in Destiny, all of your weapons and armor that you're probably going to use can reach the maximum level across all of the rarities. Whereas God of War can't. You're constantly, the game's pushing you to this higher level stuff, because obviously that's the way that the game is built. And I want to say that's partly done for accessibility. They know that big number, that power level, is going to be the easiest thing that most people are going to understand. So the stats are there to function in a certain way, but you're not really going to. I think that's kind of what a lot of this is. It's down to the fact that there's a lot of emphasis put on the power level as the main driving sort of force of the game's sort of level, of how you fight and how you upgrade your character. But the stats are there if you really want to tinker with it, but I don't think they're important or relevant or strong enough to really even be there, even for a niche audience. I know some people will have gone into super into detail in it and stuff like that, but I don't. It's so niche. Like at that point, I just think that's not the point. You want systems that people are going to always interact. You want a lot of people to interact with all these different things, and that's why I think that a better job can be done here. And I kind of think that some of these elements, particularly on the random chance elements, they are either they're somewhat misdirected, or they have been put in to avoid you from becoming too powerful, because they're worried about people just dominating everything and just wiping the entire arenas out. And I get why, but I sort of think, well, that draws people away from testing and experimenting with different items. And the same could be said about some of the lower tier armor that you can't level up. Is that there's some armor that comes with, I think there's the Traveler. No, not is it no, it's not the Traveler armor. It is the, I've forgotten the name. Of course, I have. Uh, it's the Ancients. That's what they're called. The Ancients, and their armor set gives you at least on the chest piece, it gives you a 33% resistance against frost, burn, and poison attacks, and that apparently stacks to 85% max. And it's like, I think it's a level 3 armor piece, or a level 3 armor set, that you can also upgrade to level 4, and then I assume to level 5. And it's like, well, that's like a unique perk that I don't think you can get in that form on any other piece of armor, and yet you have to get rid of it later on. Like, it's going to be too low level. I mean, maybe you could upgrade it to level 5. I think you could maybe beat the game level 5. I don't know where exactly the end of the game is. Maybe it's built so that you can get to there, but if you're doing some of the end game content kind of thing, you aren't going to get to use it. It's not, you could use it, but you're going to be dropped down level. Your stats are going to drop down. You're going to have less. It's one of those. It's like, so by having this power level be so strong, you're going to lose out on some of these more unique armor perks. So I think one way that can alleviate some of this problem, well, there's a couple of ways. One, I think an option in Ragnarok, the next God of War game, that will help is a way that you can have it so that a level scaling option, so that you can set it so that enemies scale with you, to make the game feel more like a traditional action game, which, as I said, I think is the area it shines most in. You could either go for that, or you could straight up remove the power levels and then curate enemies based on your stats. And so higher difficulties demand more of a focus and a build crafting skill, and that kind of allows people to, if you make stats mean more, then you can kind of let people properly build into them. Now, in the easier difficulties, you can make that less of a requirement, so that people can fully focus on just experiencing the story, and, it doesn't matter about power levels, they just play through it however they sort of, feel like, sort of thing. And I've watched, there's a lot of God of War videos I've watched, hear different opinions and kind of hear what other people say, and one person on YouTube called Joseph Anderson has basically, he's done like a 2 or 3 hour sort of long analysis video of God of War, and he tested out some of the power levels, and how they functioned, and as he noticed that even if you're on the easiest difficulty, being like 3 or 4 power levels below an enemy, you still die in one shot, or like one hit. And to me, like, that's strange, because it's like, but it's easy. Like, you would have thought they would have tuned it sort of differently on different difficulties to kind of to make easy be more like easy, and to require less, not following the power level kind of as much. I get why. It's not like I have a problem personally with it. It's just one of those strange things that's like, it's weird, because you've got different elements at play, right? You've got the difficulty at play, you've got the skill, like the combat, like what's the enemies, the encounters, you've got the stats, and then you've got the power level, and then you've got, I guess, like the builds and the kind of armor people are using. So you've got a lot of different elements that can affect how the game feels, but it's just weird to me that the difficulty seems to have not too much of a impact there. Uh, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the power levels were designed so that people don't have to tinker with the RPG elements too much. It's a way that kind of just makes it simple. But I think in the process, that kind of undermines the potential for what these stats could do. And it's potentially why New Game Plus gives the sort of the high bumps to stats that it does, because of the fact that it lets you properly experiment a little bit more, and you can build and lean more into one stat. And as I said, I think on the whole, these stats, because the narrative and the core combat are the biggest draws of the game, and even if the RPG elements show promise, it's, the stats feel largely forgettable, and there's not really too much room for expansiveness. And so, yeah, I think overall, I would like to just see Ragnarok come with a level scaling option to let players explore the world more freely, and put the greater emphasis on skill and combat prowess. And I think that at that point, it makes the exploration feel more interesting and engaging, because people know that they can go anywhere, but they just know that, or maybe not anywhere, because obviously some things might require later game items, but you can kind of, it's not like you're going to be held back by combat, because it's down to your build, maybe the items you've got, maybe enemies are still strong, and you can make it easier later, but it takes away that moment of like, oh, this enemy's obviously going to kill me in one hit. Oh, I'm dead. Let me try again. And you spend like 10, 15 minutes like hacking away at this enemy to get them, and then they just one shot you, and it's like, so you kind of make the game feel a bit more accessible in that regard. And I think overall it's good, because it creates more variety in the ways you can experience the game. It's an option that's there for preference and accessibility. And so obviously I've played, a lot of God of War this year, and obviously now I'm on, New Game Plus. Uh, and I've been able to see, properly how New Game Plus holds up. I played a very small amount of it years ago when it first came out, but I never fully committed to it at that point. And so there's obviously things I'm discovering. There's kind of pictures and videos I've sort of seen of it, but I've tried to not look too much into things, because I wanted it to kind of be a bit of a surprise for when I play, and I can kind of learn things and find out things as I play the New Game Plus mode. And it does a lot of cool things. Obviously, two of the armor sets I've already found so far, which is the Cod of War, a good throwback to the cod, the fish costume that you got in all the God of War games. It's very cool that they've got that. I wish it was maybe a little bit more like silly, but it's still a cool looking armor set, and it's still cool that they've got that reference in there. And I've also got an armor set based on Ares, the God of War in the original God of War games, the Greek God of War in the first game. And each of them have unique perks. The Ares armor set has an entire. Each set. It's kind of one of those. It's one global perk, and then the more pieces you've got, the greater the effects of that perk are. That's designed around building for rage. And the other one, the Codivore, is built for health zones and rage stones. One of my favorite ones I've been using is that when you use a rage stone, if you've got full rage, it gives you health, and if you've got full health and you use a health stone, you get rage, which has been cool for paired with the Ares armor because I've been gaining rage at a quicker rate. So then I've been smashing the rage stones and getting health back from them. So it kind of allows me to more often have more health options in combat, kind of thing. Not by a massive margin, but still, enough that I've noticed it like consistently in a lot of fights. But one thing that's cool about these armor pieces, I believe God of War has more luck than the Ares set, but I've been using the Ares set. I've been using 2 pieces of the Ares set and 1 piece from the God of War set. But because my luck is now at 135, which is like I think it's about at least 2 times what I had when I was playing through it at the end of my standard game. I think probably a bit more than that, actually. As I've mentioned earlier, I've been able to see a perk chance I'm sort of consistently activating it, even though it says it's a low chance. And again, as I said, it pushed me away from the blades, actually maybe use the axe, and it's a big deal for me because the blades are like home for me because I'm a big fan of the previous games, so that's my default whenever I enter a fight. I'm immediately swapping to the blades, and I want to use them because they feel so good, and I've got a lot to say on the Blades of Chaos because it's one of the greatest things in this game, and the way they introduced them is fantastic. It's great, but that's not what we're talking about here, but that's something I want to talk about at some point. But I think, yeah, as I've seen on New Game Plus, luck is obviously quite a strong stat, and it would probably be quite strong if they offered it in like the same amount here that I've got in New Game Plus, so it makes sense why it's not given like that. But I think the problem is that on standard playthroughs, it does kind of gatekeep a lot of those perks from activating, and obviously, it's kind of been a lot of what I've been talking about. But I think it's certainly, I think, a problem with letting the combat and RPG elements kind of integrate and shine properly. And so, yeah, as I said before, I don't think these perk chances really align with the vision goals of deliberate actions made in combat, because there's no intentional way to consistently and reliably activate those perks, and those items essentially are an unreliable tool in your toolbox, and if anything, they feel like nice surprises more than they do an actual part of your playstyle and build, because you just don't know they can activate at any point, unless you're building for luck and it's happening quite consistently. But when it does activate, as I've experienced, it's so cool. And to have frost and fire going off at the same time, it's like it's really cool. And it's like, this is the stuff I really want to see going into Ragnarok. But I think there's also a problem here in that because enemies require a lot of different setups and approaches, as I said before, it's almost like the game is constantly wanting you to adapt and change and go into your menu and change to that. But because of those low perk chances, you can't effectively, quickly change things or adjust your stats and things like that, because the encounters of areas change, and they don't change that drastically all the time. So you can kind of, I think, you can kind of be like, oh, I'm in Helheim now, I guess maybe I need more fire-based things. Like, you can do that, but I'm sort of like, because of how complex it is, it's like spending 5-10 minutes in the menu to kind of build for where you're at. And when you're first playing through the game, by the way, you're not really going to know what you're going to experience because it's all new. But to kind of, you probably just don't want to spend time in the menu. The menu's not exactly inviting anyway to kind of even do that. And so, even though I've spoken for ages, the point I've been leading to, which you might have been able to guess based on what I said earlier about the armor sets, is that I think these perk chances should become guaranteed instead of chances for a better, more deliberate way to become the God of War. I think a better, more deliberate choice that also enforces Kratos as the embodiment of power was if these perk chances were changed by guarantees after fulfilling a certain criteria, whether it's the same as what we've got in the game, or if it's some new kind of way. And they've already got a lot of different criteria that they use in the game anyway. So, like, the way I thought about this was, imagine if the bonuses that were on these axe pommels and blades pommels and armor sets were achieved through skill, by getting a certain number of hits without getting hit, with the axe or the blades, to get white a certain amount of seconds of a buff. whatever it is. I think this is easy to understand because you can, read it and read exactly what it says. It says do X thing, get Y seconds of this thing. And not only that, it's easy to test because you know going in that once you fulfill a certain criteria, you're going to get a certain output that is guaranteed. It's not there's no randomness, there's no guessing when it might happen. There's no unreliability. It's gonna happen as long as you fulfill that criteria. It's gonna happen. And it kind of reminds me, this idea, it sort of made me think back to God of War Ascension in the way that they had the blades that would like power up as you got hit without taking damage. You were able to do an L3 and R3 attack on different elements of the blades, but you also unlocked the longer like proper combo for Kratos' blades. And I think this could obviously work a little bit differently, but I do think that it is similar to that. It's also like 2018's permafrost and immolation for the axe and blades that build up ice and fire, respectively. But the activation criteria can be more or less demanding depending on the effect of the ability. And then this suddenly opens up a wider spectrum of the things that they can do, and how that might impact combat as a whole. So, as I mentioned earlier, since the Surtr's Grip of Flame plus Axe Pommel is from the endgame Muspelheim area, having this be consistent, it makes this reward powerful and enticing to acquire, since it could obviously and consistently enhance that moment-to-moment moveset that you've got, because again, going in what it's going to do and when it's going to do it. On top of that, Muspelheim's also available pretty early, so, while you probably won't spend time there until a lot later on, if you do brave the raging fires of Muspelheim, you might get away and might come away with like a really cool extra attack that might make the game easier. Again, we're talking in terms of 2018, but this is going to be applied to what I hope for Ragnarok. It's one of those that's like, it's one of those cool abilities that you just know, and if you hear people talking about it, you're like, oh, cool, where do I get that from? That's awesome. I had the same experience in Dark Souls the other week, and it was really cool. I saw someone invaded me, killed me after pulling out this like ridiculously looking fire sword. I was like, where do I get that? And I looked it up and I found out, and it's something that I'd already done, and it was actually related to something that I had already acquired. So it was a pretty straightforward process from that point on. But it allows people to then find, that's like one example of where one player is going to have a sense of discovery if they go to Muspelheim earlier. And again, I think that plays into the exploration elements. And of course, I'm sure that happened anyway, but if you were to just not only give those unique benefits of like, oh, it increases strength and health, have like a unique thing that changes the weapon that you've currently got. I guess the only problem is that that's at the point before you get the blades, and if people thought that was too good, then that might undermine how good the blades are, kind of thing. That there are a lot of things like this, and to be fair, that might be why they held back. Actually, to be fair, but if it all worked, again, I'm thinking what sounds cool, but of course, in practice, who knows how players would react. But I think overall, you could have a lot of unique rewards spread out through the entire game that would result in combat becoming more varied and personalized, and that is something that Eric Williams, the director for God of War Ragnarok, has said, is that I think they want to offer more personalization and more ways that people can express themselves in the combat, and I'm interested to know what that means. I hope that's going to I'm hoping that what I'm saying here makes sense, and that's kind of the direction that they're thinking about, because that'd be pretty cool. But in terms of what I'm talking about here, pommels are a pretty easy thing to swap in and out, unlike enchantments. So these unique pommels, if you need a specific element, or you want to test out an attack, or know an attack is certainly good against an enemy, if there was going to be any menu time, which not everyone likes anyway, and some people like action games just being like straight up constantly in the combat, but God of War isn't fully that. That could be a point where you could go into your menu, swap to another pommel, and then go back into the game, and it's a simple process that shouldn't take too long. I mean, it might take a bit of time if you're just kind of getting used to it, but once you kind of pick up the game and know what you're looking for, then that sort of just comes with the territory. When you get used to it, it's not too bad. Maybe Santa Monica don't want that, but I suspect they would like that, because you are embracing some of the build crafting elements they've got in the game, and I think that's a good thing. So I think this is something that they would like to happen. I assume that's why a lot of these buildcrafting and the armor and the things exist in the game, because they want people to, of course they want people to embrace all the elements of the game. And this does tie into some of the enchantments as well, because they tie into like the overall effects of stats, and enchantments are, enchantments are kind of like for min-maxing builds anyway, so like it's kind of like it ties into some of that, and I would like to see the overall game become more consistent, but enchantments are the sort of slight stat tunings and adding little things like, and so I think even if they have perk chances that can potentially occur, that's not too bad, because they're not really meant to be driving your build. But I do think this same idea could be extended to them. But yeah, as I said, they can add a lot of these different pommels into the game, and as you find them, in the case of like my New Game Plus experience, you can build your weapon to do more than one element. Maybe not consistently, but it's going to probably activate on that certain criteria. On top of additional bonuses. So I was thinking one idea I had was that you could go really specific, that you could get a bonus to, like given to, or taken from a skill like Executioner's Cleave. So you could have it where it's like, I don't know, get 2 precision axe throws, and your next Executioner's Cleave like activates immediately, or it does double damage, or you do an Executioner's Cleave like, and you get half your permafrost gain back. Like, and at this point, I think you can honestly make the axe more of a, maybe you can take the pommel and make different elements that are customizable about it, so you can kind of build the axe to look the way you want, like entirely, and each particular part of the axe has something unique about it that allows you to kind of customize the axe to feel, to be like your version of the Leviathan axe. And same with Blades of Chaos. And I think, again, it's these ways that I'm just like, there's so much they could do here. The permafrost and immolation build-ups on the axe and blades, they could feature different effects or unique finishes. You can include ranged attacks. Maybe there's some there's honestly so many things, and I think if you just open up the potential for these abilities and make sure they happen consistently, they can be balanced and curated around a lot of different ways to approach combat. And of course, they can be activated in a number of ways. You can have it based on the number of hits, whether with or without taking damage, to sort of charge up the weapon. And you could even add the combo counter back as another thing to show that, or something like that. Just to, maybe that can come back as an Easter egg or something like bonus. But yeah, you could have activate a precision axe throw by applying a status effect to an enemy. That, as I said, there's so many ways so many ideas that you can have, and so many ways you can activate it as well. But in the process of all of this, the pommels are becoming deliberate and understandable modifications on a specific weapon you're using, without the randomness of when those effects will work. And players are able to pick those based on their playstyle. And by using the upgrade paths, they can, it can be used to unlock new effects or just enhance existing ones. And maybe the rate at which it activates is reduced. Or increased, reduced. That's right, yeah. So you can have it so that if it's 10 hits without getting hit, it's 8 hits, and sure, that's not much, but that means you'd get it twice in 16 hits rather than twice in 20 hits, and, it's things like that. So you can, again, you're building your axe to be the way that you want it to be. And I think this ties into that character fantasy of Kratos. As they said, he's meant to be the embodiment power, so if he wants something to happen, he'll make it happen. And as I said earlier, he wouldn't just hit an enemy like, I'm going to keep hitting them until something happens, and probably by that point he's killed them anyway. It just doesn't seem like Kratos. So this next idea, I don't really think it needs to sort of change at all. I think they're okay as they are, but I thought I might as well talk about Runic Attacks, and because they're another element of that kind of moment-to-moment, the magical, elemental kind of, build style, play style elements. And I think in some ways they can have some play in some of this more guaranteed combat. I don't think it needs to. I don't think they really need to change. So yeah, I think they can stay as cooldowns, with stat boosts for cooldown. I think it would be a good idea if stat boost for cooldown is more widely available. Something that you're able to more easily build into. But I obviously know that that is kind of a form of strength. So if you're building into something that's going to recharge your runics, then you probably don't want to have, it's again, it all needs to be balanced in a way that means you can't just like go and tear shit up like at any point kind of thing. You know, obviously there's still balance to be had here. It's not all let's go crazy. You know, and the game still needs to offer some level of challenge. But the way I was thinking about this was that instead of necessarily having cooldown be more available, you could have certain elements like pommels or enchantments that can grant extra charge to your runic attacks, whether it's a specific runic, like light runic attack, or whether it's just runics in general. You know, sticking with that theme of doing a thing, a deliberate choice that you're making, the player's making, and then having an obvious and easy to tell output, you know, on the other end of that, so that you know what you're getting into, you know what you're doing, and it allows you to kind of properly build around it. So an idea that I had was that maybe an enchantment or some kind of pommel could grant a 20% chance to both runics for your axe on a successful executioner's cleave, or 5% on the precision axe throw. And both of these could obviously, you know, the exact amount could be like changed, you know, or it could have a temporary cooldown so that it stops you from just spamming the runic over, or sorry, the you know, the activation thing all the time, because otherwise that would, you know, that would then make things way too easy, because the people would just constantly use that thing over and over again and just keep spamming runics. But I think, honestly, on the whole, runic attacks are fine because of their cooldown is kind of pretty well managed, I think, in the game. And cooldown is actually a stat that I've seen and messed about with. My actual current cooldown is at 177, so it's like, I'm you know, I've got like a pretty big decrease from what they originally are. And on Gimme God of War, the actual timers for cooldowns on runics are actually higher than they are on the other difficulties as well. But again, yeah, I think generally with runics they kind of fulfill that deliberate decision and understanding with both how and when they're used, as well as predictable cooldown rates, which is obviously shown not only in the menu with the actual timer, but it's also shown on the HUD with the like rising bar. I wish it was a little bit more obvious when it was fully charged, because sometimes it can have like there's a little animation I think that's kind of on that plays on it that you know, to show it's fully charged, but it's not always obvious. Like you can't look over it quickly and necessarily always tell it's ready. Most of the time it's fine, but there are certain cases where it doesn't feel like it's. You're like, is that about to be done, or is that done? Like, is it just finished? You know. And again, cooldown can be affected by more elements in the game, and I think that some of those effects that you can apply, sort of, you know, add to the game and can be added as part of that build crafting and decision making that you're making, both in combat and also as part of your preferred playstyle, and how you want to build Kratos as a character. So I sort of want to talk about enchantments a little bit, only a small bit, because I sort of touched upon them earlier, as a way. I was referring about that they could also be a guarantee, and that it doesn't really matter if they're perk chance, because they're kind of ways to tinker and just add to your build a little bit extra. But I do think that there are ways it can be made as a guarantee and have, you know, more of a obvious effect in the game, something that's more deliberate. And again, I don't want to seem like I'm running away with that word, but that was a keyword used in Corey's vision book, from my understanding. So that's kind of, I'm trying to think about things that kind of fit in with that particular design goal. But I think what's something that could be done is that they could kind of go kind of similar to how Destiny has it, where they have what I would sort of call like a pick 10 system, where you have 10 points that you can spend on armor to slot in certain mods and certain enchantments, obviously in God of War's case, enchantments. And the potential power, or the power of a mod, is, if it's a stronger mod, they will up the cost of it, and if it's less powerful, they'll lower the cost of it. So you could have some really strong enchantments in God of War, but have them cost like 7. So then you could only have, you know, you could have like an enchantment that's only 1 slot, and then you can have another enchantment that only takes up 2 slots, and then you could have that one that takes up 7. And that's kind of what you're building. You could have more smaller incremental things kind of put together, and that kind of allow you to kind of like boost up your stats, and they're all like little incremental things. You know, and I think something like that would then again, it's easy to understand. You can then make things a guarantee. You can control their usage a bit more. You know, of course, there's going to be tons of testing that have to be done. I mean, in general for the game, but also if something like this existed. But it's easy. I think I'd say it's easier to balance because, you know, people aren't just like having it activate all the time. You can kind of control a little bit more and make it more deterministic as to when it's going to actually happen. So for anything they want to do that's super powerful, just increase the cost of it. So one of the final big topics I want to talk about here is the overall meaning of stats and the tuning curves for God of War. Kind of on Give Me God of War, but just generally as a whole, the kind of stats and their implementation into the game. I think stats overall are pretty difficult to understand in terms of what they do. The descriptions kind of tell you what they do, and so you get an idea of like, oh, if I put points into that's what's going to increase. But there's no actual clear indication as to how much each point is worth and what that's actually doing as you're building armor. And particularly early on when you first start getting armor, sure, you're watching your stats go up, but you're never really getting a noticeable change in what's happening. I think the what I noticed on in sort of endgame stuff was that if I jacked Runic up a lot, I noticed that. I noticed like a big difference in terms of damage. I mean, it wasn't massive, but it was certainly noticeable. Like I was telling that, I could tell that. But that's at the end of the game. Vitality you can track because it increases health. You can track that in the menu. Luck you can, I think, generally, as I've experienced, by having it pretty high, it's been visible in the game. And cooldown, you can technically know it's in the game, but you can also flick back and forth between the weapons pages and see the runic attack times changing. But generally, things like strength and defense, and every stat kind of has their weirdness to them. I think there isn't really a proper indication as to what they're doing, and you never really feel that in combat. And in one of the other GDC talks from Mihir Sheth, he talks about, I believe it was called Evolving God of War, Evolving Combat in God of War for a New Perspective was the GDC talk presentation he had, and he spoke about on Give Me God of War about how stat curves changed, and obviously alongside a bunch of other changes for Give Me God of War as a whole. Quote, he says, the stat tuning curves are completely different, so your choices in what you choose to equip matter a lot more. And while I'm sure obviously that's obviously true, I wish we knew more about like what was being affected, particularly in the early game. And to be fair, I think Give Me God of War is honestly more difficult in the early game when you have less armor and you've got less skills, less things to kind of fight back against enemies with. The game actually feels like it gets a little bit easier as you go through, outside of certain cases like Muspelheim, Niflheim, and the Valkyrie fights. And I assume that for Give Me God of War specifically, that what he means is that there's more points that are needed for each stat to receive the benefits. But that feels kind of weird because you don't get total freedom over stat distribution. There is no only strength armor. Armor is kind of like with set stats, and you can upgrade the armor, but you can never fully like have like an armor that's entirely designed for strength. You just have it where it's more of a preference in that particular stat, and maybe that's by design. Maybe they want you to bring all these other stats up, but again, it sort of makes that sort of whole building for a specific stat a difficult sort of choice, especially on Give Me God of War when you want to keep your resources, because you probably want to buy new armor as it becomes available, particularly to get your level up. And that was certainly my thing. I was doing all side content as soon as I could to work on getting my level higher than what the enemies I was going to fight, because I knew otherwise it would be like an uphill battle kind of thing. And I think if stats were more customizable, I think those higher stat curves would be better, since you could kind of more easily target what you want to build for. And as I was kind of writing this, one of my random ideas was that maybe they could allow you to apply stats more to Kratos himself rather than the armor, with armor pieces being more there for cosmetic purposes, and perks being sort of a thing that you can socket as a separate thing, so you can pick your armor and then socket a perk from another armor set into that one. And that's similar to how Spider-Man works from Insomniac. They have the different suits, and you can kind of pick and choose. You can have one suit, but you can have the abilities from another suit. I still think it's cool when armor and perks are identifiable from the visual thing. You can kind of easily sort of tell it, but it is a single player game after all, so you're not going to have that kind of problem in like a PvP environment where you're going to have people running around in like some armor set that looks completely different to the things they're using, kind of thing. I know that's been a problem with Destiny, is that I say a problem, something that Bungie have acknowledged and said that that's why they wouldn't deviate too far from certain things, because they want people to be able to, they want you to look the way that you want to look, but they know that you can't totally have freedom because it might hide some of that, the visual, and you can't immediately look at someone and go, oh, they've got that exotic on or whatever. But I do think in terms of God of War, because it's a single player game, most players would honestly prefer the freedom for visuals to separate from the gameplay benefits, so they can kind of, it's a little bit more accessible, tailor made. People can kind of build again visually and functionally how they want, sort of thing. Uh, and I think to sort of add to this, it would be cool if the thresholds and additional unlocks were a bit more clear. There are some things on the skill trees that do, unlock certain elements. Like, for example, the skill, on a lot of them, they increase resistance to interruption during the particular attack. Which I don't think is too much of an exciting element. That's boosted by vitality. I don't think that's a. It doesn't really make me go, oh cool, that's something that I want to build for. It's not like it's literally protecting you from the damage. You're still going to take the damage. You just don't get interrupted, which I think can be a jarring thing in games anyway, because I mean, it's from preference. A lot of games do it, so I'm sure some people like it. But for me, if I'm going to get hit, I kind of want to know about it or be able to get out of the way, rather than be finishing my attack and maybe putting myself in a worse position. But yeah, in terms of the extra stats themselves, I just wish we knew how much each point is worth. And if we equip an armor piece that has plus 20 strength, what is the change in the game to what we're doing? And referring back to that Joseph Anderson video I did earlier, I mentioned earlier, he pointed out that the defense stat seems to work on a subtraction system, which is how I understood it, that it obviously reduces the incoming damage based on your level and the enemy's level. But if they're higher level than you, it's not going to make too much difference by changing the defense stat in like small increments. It's only going to make more of a difference if you really jack it up high, which usually you can't do. And by the time you can do it, it's probably not going to change anything anyway, because the enemies you come up against are either going to be one, stronger, or two, a higher level, or still at the same levels as you, sort of thing. But it does work because obviously a lot of enemies are respawned at different higher levels and things like that. So there is some places that can still have an impact. But I think, as I said earlier, I think vitality and cooldown are probably the only two we actually see reflected in the menu with how they apply their effects. And unfortunately, cooldown requires you to constantly flick back and forth between two pages, which is a less than ideal option when you're kind of deep in the armor customization screen and you're trying to work out what particular stat you want to tweak and what you want to add on, kind of thing. Okay, so before I fully end this and wrap everything up, I sort of want to just talk about a few extra miscellaneous points that I've thought about with God of War, and that kind of don't really spend too much time on them. One thing is that I find the weapon levels are weird. For example, why is the max level for the axe level 6, but for the blades it's level 5? And obviously they have their own boosted stats. So the axe has plus 85 strength, and the blades have plus 50 runic. But I've never fully understood why they are the way that they are. Why? I think it's just the way that it falls, and the way that the axe is like at level 5 or something when you get the blades. So it's just a strange, strange thing. Something that ties into the last section that I didn't mention there was the stat values are weird in that the value to fill up the stat bar is different for every single stat. So going by some guesses that I've made based on my Give Me God of War New Game Plus run, so of course they might be a bit wrong, and so I apologize if they are. The maximum strength, at least to fill out the bars, for strength it's 300, for runic it's 250, for defense it's 300, for vitality it's 200, for luck it's 150, and for cooldown it's 200. I don't really understand why they're all on the different own scales that they're doing here. I don't really understand why it's so random like this, because it's like, it just makes it confusing. It's confusing to be able to work out why they're all a different max level. Why are the stat values different? Another thing that I don't understand is why talismans that have cooldown abilities don't show the cooldown timer, and that too is affected by the cooldown stat. So why can you not see the cooldown timer on talismans? Again, you can see it in the game, obviously, as it's charging back up, you can see that, but you can't see the exact timer in the menu as to how long it's going to take to recharge its ability. And I've got no idea why. And I think some of them might reduce the cooldown rate as you upgrade it, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. But Yeah, I don't really understand that one. The user interface, I'm largely fine with. I think I heard a lot of people say they didn't like it. I personally thought it was okay, but it is a bit clunky, to be fair, and I don't think it's really inviting to a lot of people, as a lot of people have sort of expressed. So I don't really understand why I don't know what they'll do there, because I think it's difficult to fully know how to design these user interfaces that are very, they obviously want to show your stat. They want to keep. I think that's the thing. They're obviously trying to keep everything on screen. So and I think in a lot of ways it's a well put together user interface, but it is, like I said, a bit clunky to kind of get quickly to the thing you want to get to, particularly for customizing armor. And the last point here is when you have the cutscenes with Brock and Sindri, the two dwarf blacksmiths. They obviously they've got that kind of bickering back and forth about each other and what what's he done to the axe, let me fix it, and they've got some cool banter about that. But the weird thing to me is that they have a sort of buff that they give you called Mark of the Dwarves, and that sits in your resource screen, and it adds +4 to Runic after the different cutscenes. And I remember when I first played through it, and it's like I was always confused what was going on. I was like, oh, what's Mark of the Dwarves? Before I obviously knew where to look to find that out. And then later on, Kratos asked Brock what he did to his axe, and Brock just says it's better. And it's a funny moment, but it also doesn't really play it like you hope. I was hoping that there would be something obvious that it was better with, but it's just by the end of the game, I think I've got like +16 Runic because it happens 4 times. I think two from each of them. Or maybe it's more than that. I don't know. But it's like 4 Runic on its own is pointless. And well, at least from my understanding, I never noticed anything different. And 16 Runic at the end. It's like what is that doing? I was hoping, the cutscene, the fact that it's in a cutscene as well is weird to me because it suggests that it'll be something more interesting, but it's only a +4 Runic. I just don't get it. And there are other permanent bonuses you can find in the world, but they're found randomly as you explore, and they're pretty easy to come across. And they don't do much themselves. They're just like an extra 2 to the associated stat that it's for. But the thing that's better with them is that they're less vague, and they're kind of like collectibles rather than like a proper reward following a story cutscene. And since there's only like a few of them in the story, I don't know why the Brock and Sindri cutscenes weren't giving you something more obvious that was going to do something. Like, does anyone ever notice +4 Runic? And maybe it's just for a joke. Maybe it's just kind of it's just some kind of idea that they're trying to, that they can tell the other ones worked on it, I guess, so they make it better. I think that's maybe what it's done, and they just thought they'd give you a little boost, but I think 4 Runic is pointless, and I think that maybe they could have done something a little bit more interesting. But I suppose if it's a joke to kind of fit in with their kind of banter, then it sort of makes sense. It doesn't make sense at first though, because you get that buff. I think does Brock give it to you first, or does Sindri give it to you at first? I'm not too sure. I think if Sindri gives it to you first, then maybe that's part of the joke. But I just I think they could have done a little bit more there, or some way to again, if stats meant more, or you knew more about stats, you could sort of understand what that was doing a bit more than you can. So to finally end this this movie that this video has kind of sort of turned into, I kind of want to talk about looking forward to God of War Ragnarok, and just sort of talking about what are my hopes for the game in regards to the RPG elements of the game. I think first and foremost, I don't want Ragnarok to forget these RPG systems. I don't think it will, but I don't want them to kind of like give up or think that they don't want to do them because they just didn't feel like they hit the right bar. Again, we don't fully know. I don't think their view on them, and I think again you sort of set a standard with the first game. So if anything, I think it can only go up from here, right? I think it's only going to get better, because I think there's potential for a lot of growth here in the combat and RPG, and we've already seen some stuff in the trailer that looks like that. But I really want to hone in on letting players like truly build craft their own way, and make it so that easier difficulties can also play their own way. Whilst something like Give Me God of War will demand more knowledge and skill in both combat and build crafting. but in the process of this is that I want them, like, I hope they can keep like pretty much every single build viable for a true like amount of variety. You know, for like I was thinking like I don't think this is realistic because God of War's got a varying set of enemies, but if people could beat the entire game with fists only at level 1 on Give Me God of War, I think that'd be pretty great. You know, or if people could build around that or something like that without while staying at level 1, if power levels stay, obviously. But of course, that's, you know, as I said, that's not an easy thing to design to be entirely viable. But I think it's when things like that happen in the game that shows that the game is quite open to letting you kind of use what you want, kind of thing. I think power levels can stay. I think that they would work by staying. But similar to what I just said, hopefully builds can live on past this. Like, hopefully they're not held back by, you know, being a lower level or something like that. But I think a way to sort of circumvent that is by adding a power level scaling option, so the players can turn it on to then be able to like entirely focus on their playstyle and have the game be fully about combat skill, as well as it's an accessible avenue for like players to play the game how they want without having to like, you know, upgrade armor and focus on that. Like it can literally just be another way to let players experience the story of the game without it being super demanding all the time, you know, whilst also giving the other end of the spectrum more abilities and more potential for build crafting. And another thing is that like God of War, like its universe is brimming with like magical abilities and unique elements. So like they've got, and on top of that, they've got the Greek mythology to pull from, so I think they've got a great advantage for unique and visual gameplay designs. You know, for example, one cool thing about the New Game Plus on 2018 is that they have armor designs inspired by Greek gods, like the Ares one I mentioned earlier. There's another one for Zeus, I think. And I'm like, they could do more of that stuff. They could bring back like cool things from the previous games to kind of use here. They could inspire, you know, there's so much they could do, and I think a way that they can kind of make this more of a, you know, give a narrative reason for this is that, well, Tyr, the Norse god of war, is going to be in Ragnarok, at least unless he's like Odin in disguise or something like that. But if Tyr's there, well, since he's traveled across all the realms like Greece and Egypt, which we've seen on the murals in his temple in the first game, there's so much that he found that like who knows what else he's got out there. He of course he could have like he could have the Blade of Olympus, for example. Like it could, there's so much they can do, and so many cool like narrative things they could probably pull from, that I think having those two mythologies that you can kind of intertwine potentially with some Egyptian stuff in there as well, it's very cool for some of the potential things that we can get, both in terms of their functional ability, but also in terms of their visual design sort of thing. I think overall having more armor sort of designs overall, you know, I don't know what sort of, you know, because like you have like the shoulder guard one, then you have the one that's kind of like almost like that joins both the left and right shoulders, and then you have like the full armor, and there's a few variations on those, but I hope we get some more, you know, some kind of more varied designs, and I think some armors do look a bit weird on Kratos. I think they could do a little bit better there, and somehow, I don't know if that's just to do with his character model, and it could just be weird because we're not used to seeing him like that. It could there's a few different things I think, but I'm sure they're on the visual, you know, graphic stuff, and I'm not really going to worry about the visual and art design of a game like God of War. I think their art design and just it's so good. Like the North, this, you know, 2018's got so many great locations, and it's one of those things that like I'm pointing out here because it sort of ties into the RPG elements, but you know, it's not really, I don't really have a worry about it. One thing I think would be cool though is if you could maybe change colors or something like that. I don't know if that would really fit the game, uh, but I still think that that's something that they could do to sort of, you know, add a little bit more, you know, player personality into the armor that they're using, sort of thing. Um, One thing that I think I think they will, but I don't want to set expectations too high just in case they don't. But I hope we get another weapon or two in Ragnarok, and I hope they're both, or what, you know, they're as fully functional as the axe, blades, and the shield. And we know we're getting new stuff for the shield. They show a little bit off it in the trailer, um, but I just, even though I'm sure there's some cool stuff I can do with the axe and blades and shield, I don't want that to be all the game is. Like I want them to do more than that, you know. And I think, you know, requesting another weapon on the same scale as the axe, blades, and shield when they're potentially going to be expanding themselves, I think that's probably a bit of a tall order, You know, it's quite a lot, but I also that's typically it's typically been a God of War thing. Every game's had like a new weapon, you know, at least one or two. Um, and I just feel like if we're going to start off with the axe and blades pretty early on, something's going to have to change on Kratos' end for the combat to be able to help it not feel as samey as it did with 2018. And another sort of hope that I have is that it launches with the New Game Plus mode, like out the gate. Hopefully, it will be as substantial, if not more, than 2018's as well. Because you know, while I've not finished the New Game Plus yet, it does a pretty good job at making it feel like a different game on a second playthrough. You know, even if it takes a bit of time to introduce some of its newer armor sets, I assume that's just kind of, you know, just kind of the progression, and it might be designed so that the idea is you're meant to play it a third time to kind of get everything, and then you can kind of play it again and test it all out. And I think that's potentially my plan, is that that's what I'll do. And because I'm pretty impressed with this, and there's going to be a lot to test out. I think this New Game Plus mode is it's a good sign for the future, but it's also New Game Plus, so I don't know if that's going to change their sort of overall way that they design Ragnarok kind of thing, just because it's New Game Plus. But hopefully, either it will come as an update just after launch, or it will pretty much launch right out the gate with it. A New Game Plus mode would be really cool. But I think, you know, to kind of round this all up, I think I just want them to overall streamline the game to make all of its elements easier to understand and implement, whilst also like widening the pool for the potential build options that there is, because there really is potential here. But I don't want Ragnarok to feel the same as 2018 kind of thing, you know. And like I know that Santa Monica is obviously adding new stuff, and that's a given. And I'm not saying that what I've said here is the only way it can be done, sort of thing. But I just really hope that Ragnarok is truly different, because I'm curious how they think Santa Monica. What do they think of the RPG elements? You know, because 2018 to me feels like the stats are only there for show, unless you like really build into them. And I kind of want Ragnarok to kind of take that further and make them matter more, while sort of embracing its magical elements, because of you know, it's perfect for the world of the game. You know, especially with the lineage of Greek and, you know, the Greek games following behind it, sort of thing. I just want it to be like the ultimate God of War Norse game that clearly builds on what we've got whilst adding new things. And we've seen new things. We've seen the ledge grapple with the blades, and also the enemy grapple, and Kratos jumped off a ledge and done a slam attack from off a ledge. So we're already seeing some verticality come into play for both attacks and traversal, which is a cool element. But I just hope that those sort of, you know, in tandem with enemy design, some of the abilities on Kratos' side, maybe a new weapon or two, to kind of, you know, to make it, to kind of evolve the RPG elements to be deeper, more consistent, streamlined, and accessible, all at the same time, which is totally easy, of course, I'm sure. I'm sure all devs at Santa Monica are just being like, oh yeah, it's a walk in the park. No, of course it's not. It's a lot of work, I imagine. As we saw with 2018 as well. But at the end of the day, I expect, and I'm pretty certain that Ragnarok's going to be a good game, you know, regardless of how the RPG elements turn out. But I do want them to pick a direction, you know, to either embrace the RPG more, you know, kind of like how I described. But I you know, I say that, but then I've also got that kind of side of me that just wants God of War as an action adventure game. But I do think that's where that level, sort of level scaling system can come into play, because both can work then, you know, and it allows them to kind of put more emphasis on the RPG, but offer, you know, and that level scaling thing could be turned on by default on easy, so that people can just have a sense of just purely playing the game and kind of, you know, enjoying it that way. And as I said, I think the action adventure elements are where 2018 stands above, like, or that stands above all the other elements they've got, sort of thing. So I, you know, hope they obviously evolve that and things like that. But yeah, I'm going to wrap it up here. There is so much I have to say on God of War. There's so many cool things to talk about, so many things. Like, this is a very long sort of critique that I've done, and sort of, well, to critique and praise and kind of mix and hope for Ragnarok is kind of all sort of blended into the same thing. It's kind of a very, you know, here's what I think would be cool. But of course, you know, I'm not a developer. I've made a game before, but not like a massive AAA budget game. Certainly nothing at all like this. But I'm very interested in how the game's made and all those elements, and I just hope that, you know, I'm sure Santa Monica, they were very. I remember Corey Barlog was on Twitter and other interviews being very upfront about, you know, like not having enough bosses, or, you know, wishing they had more time to finish different things. And I sounds like they cut a lot of stuff, and it's possible that a lot of that stuff makes it into Ragnarok, as well as new stuff they're gonna make. You know, so it could be a massive game. But that's even more so why I just want all these elements to really breathe and to really like really stand out and make it so that God of War becomes like the action adventure kind of elements that it had in the original games, which they've sort of got here, but build on it by bringing in some more of those magical elements and kind of making them more consistent and easy to use. But yeah, as I said, there's tons to talk about, and I haven't even spoken about the Blades of Chaos. The scene where you get them is probably one of my favorite moments. It probably is my favorite moment in any game ever. I just think that there's honestly a lot of great scenes in 2018, but particularly getting the Blades back is just such a... No other game, I don't think, has ever evoked the reaction that scene and that whole lead up got from me, and it continues to blow me away. Even today, I've watched reactions to it. I've played it several times myself. I've watched the cutscene back several times. I've listened to the music from it. I've met, you know, a lot of the time, when I load up the game, I will randomly just I'll start, and just before I start moving, I'll just like attack with the blade, and it's so cool how they put that weapon into the game. But of course, I'm on Team Axe now. I've swapped from Team Blades to Team Axe because I'm now loving this pommel that I found on New Game Plus. That's really cool. But yeah, so if anyone's listened to this far, because this is a very long, very long. I think this is, I had a guess since I haven't fully checked it. I think it's probably an hour and a half to 2 hours ish. Around about that. It's a pretty long talk. Some of it's rambly, but I think generally my points are there. And my goal is to leave timestamps in the description, which you would have already seen by now, since we're at the end of the video, so that's pointless me telling you now. But I guess, yeah, if you want to jump back to any sections, there should be timestamps that sort of let you jump back to specific points. And maybe I'll include some extra, like, thoughts and whatever in the description. But what do you think? Anyone that's been listening, what's everyone else's thoughts? Because I think, you know, there's obviously potential. There's obviously, you know, it's not like these stats don't do anything. But I think for me and from a lot of other people that I've heard, I never hear people talking about the RPG elements of the game unless you go to like the really like niche parts of like YouTube and stuff like that. And it's cool that people make videos of builds, but it just doesn't feel like it's the same level that you can get from other games. But it's also Santa Monica's first shot at this. I just hope that for the next game they let people embrace some more of that power fantasy of Kratos, to embody what it's like to be the God of War, and to just be extremely powerful. Not too powerful that it just kind of, you know, makes the game easy, but powerful enough that you obviously, you know, there's many ways of expression of power in the game that you'll see a lot of different players utilizing, and it will be in such a noticeable way that everyone, obviously not everyone, but a lot of people are going to find the different ways. They're going to equip different things, and they're going to use different methods of attack and whatever. Hopefully in a way that's consistent, because I think, you know, though there's some really cool stuff they've put into this game, and I don't think very few people are going to know about it, because they've hidden it away in like specific locations, or they've put it as like a low perk chance thing. And I hope that gets expanded on, and that they maybe commit, and they're a little bit more lenient with letting you use what you want to use and build how you want to use. But I'm gonna stop rambling now. If you've listened as far as I've said, thank you. Tell me what you think. Leave what do you think in the comments. You know, hope you have a good Christmas. If you celebrated, Happy New Year, and I will talk to you in the next video, whenever that'll be. So, thanks for listening, and I'll see you later. Ciao, 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 ciao.